Thanks for having me here, and thanks for showing up on this cold, icy night. I did that. So, as Rachel said earlier, it's interesting, like the title of this talk. Honestly, I didn't plan on this. It was only on my way while driving here I realized. I saw, I think, some ad on the freeway on some billboard about Valentine's Day. Then I thought, oh, this is appropriate, title for the talk. So basically, the thing I'll be talking about is how do different sensory cues interact and how does it influence our perceptions. So it's about a whole range of issues. The first few slides I'll be going through fast because it's more like marketing background information. But if anything is not clear or if you want me to go through something in more details, feel free to stop me anytime. Okay, so just to give you some background information as to what marketing researchers are focusing on, previously or historically, most of marketing research has focused on non-sensory cues or what are called informational cues, like brand reputation, warranty, return policies, packaging, price, and so forth. An emerging trend is examining how the sensory cues for a product might influence people's judgments. So what are sensory cues? So basically, there are 5 major sensory cues, as you know. There are actually more than 5, but these 5 are the ones that are relevant for most businesses. So like our taste, sight, hearing, smell, and touch. And I'll talk a lot about how they interact with each other, especially focusing on the visual aspect, like the visual sensory cue. Okay, and as I said, we know prior research focused on non-experiential issues. Recently, there's a trend from many companies, and you must have seen it at supermarkets, at stores, at malls, where they place a lot of emphasis on the sensory aspect. Like if you go to a shopping mall, before you buy, let's say, a perfume or a cologne, you get to sample it with that smell strip. So that's, again, appealing to your sensory, sort of sensory node. And the sensory cues are used in a big way, and the usage is increasing, as is evident from the fact that in the US alone, every year, companies give out more than $1 billion worth of samples. So if you go to Sam's Club or BJ's or Costco, you get the food sample. That, again, is trying to appeal to your sensory cue of, let's say, taste that you would not otherwise get just by looking at the package. So this is basically just to give you an idea about what's going on in the real world. And again, airline companies, restaurants, they are trying to sort of target the sensory nodes. So let's first start off with the visual thing. So I have all these 5 sensory cues, and I'll talk briefly or at length about all 5 of these, but let's start with the visual things. But before that, a couple of things to keep in mind. First of all, senses can actually be imagined. We don't always have to sort of be exposed to a sensory cue in order to experience it. We can actually imagine sensory, our senses can be imagined by ourselves. So for example, you can visualize something without actually having seen that, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. Another very important thing, and I'll spend some time talking about it, is there can be individual differences in how we react to different sensory stimulations. So for example, what might be hot and spicy for one of you won't be that hot or spicy for someone else. Similarly, what might be hot in terms of touch to one of you might not be that hot to someone else. So what might be cold to you might not be that cold to someone else. You get the idea. So, and that has implications for cross-cultural aspects, gender issues, and so forth. And again, along the same lines, the sensory arousal differences can be due to several factors. Some of it is physiological, I'll talk about it. Some of it could be cultural or sort of non-physiological, like induced differences. Okay, so let's talk about vision or the visual cues in the first instance. So there are 3 aspects. So basically, in order to experience a visual cue, you need to have the attention. And you need to have the imagery and the neural activation. And I'll talk about all of these. Okay, so let's start off talking about these in details. First of all, one unique aspect of visual cues, and you'll see that later when I talk about the other sensory cues, visual cues tend to dominate all our other 4 sensory cues that we'll talk about. So visual cues tend to be the most dominant sensory cue consciously or subconsciously. That's one unique aspect about visual cues. The second aspect or unique aspect of visual cues is it's non-proximal in nature. Or in other words, you can have or you can be visually aroused even when being exposed to a stimulus at a very large distance. So I can see something that's at least 200 feet away through that door, but I'm sure I cannot smell something 500 feet away, or I cannot always hear something a mile away, but on a clear day I can see something 4 miles away. So visual cues, one unique aspect is you don't need the proximity always in order to experience that cue. The second another interesting aspect about the visual cue is we can simultaneously process multiple visual cues, which we cannot do with some of these other sensory cues, as we would see in a few minutes. So right now, literally, I am being exposed and processing thousands of visual cues simultaneously right now. Like I can see someone wearing a black scarf, a green sweater, a blue jeans, and so forth. And I can sometimes do that without even moving my head. Like sometimes it's in the peripheral vision also. So I can actually process a whole lot of visual sensory cue, which I cannot do with some of these other sensory cues, and we'll see in a few minutes. So that's another important aspect. The other aspect that also becomes relevant is we do not always necessarily need to be aware. Like I'm processing a lot of visual cues that I'm also not actually being aware of. I mean, unless I'm focusing on it deliberately or paying a lot of attention to that. So that, again, is an important aspect. Okay. Now, let's move on to talking about the visual cues, like how do we have the preferences. So there are different factors, as I said at the beginning. So our physiological aspects as well as non-physiological aspects can influence. So by non-physiological aspects would be cultural issues. So that can influence our perceptions of visual cues. So one instance of visual cues, so visual cues can be of different types, can be color, shape, size. So let's talk about color for a few minutes. So our preference for colors or how we react to colors are different based on physiological and cultural issues. So for example, the color blue, it has been shown like when you use the color blue, people are more relaxed than, let's say, when you use the color red. In fact, right now we are doing some exploratory research. I mean, we have some data collected through some experiments, me and a co-author from a school in Illinois. What we found was, this was a very simple experiment, but the results were very interesting. So we had a web page across different experimental conditions. So in one condition, people had a web page. It was like a typical shopping website. The web page background color was blue, the skyish blue kind of thing, somewhat along these lines. So the web page color was light blue. And in another group, we had the same web page, the same content, everything was same, except the color was changed to something like red, bright red. We found a lot of interesting sort of patterns of results. First of all, one of the measures we used was, like, what's your perception of risk while shopping from this website? This was just a made-up website. We just formed it. Like, it's not Amazon or one of those established websites. So interesting finding was, and we also asked them, how likely are you to give your credit card information, personal information on the website and all. So in the condition, in the group where they saw the blue-colored website, people had lower perceived risks. They were more willing to give out their credit card information number or some other personal information. But the same web page, when the color was changed to red, bright red, people were a lot more hesitant in giving out credit card information, personal information. So they had higher perceived risk. So again, that relates to basically the finding that has been observed in many neurological sciences studies. Like the color blue elicits feelings of relaxation. And there have been several studies, I mean, for the last 20, 30 years by people in neurological sciences, psychology, where they found exposure to the color blue acted as a relaxing thing for people. Color red was excitement. Now, why? Why does this happen? So researchers have tried to explain that through two mechanisms. So one is the physiological aspect. Like the color blue and the color red have different wavelengths. So in fact, blue has one of the shortest wavelengths and red has one of the longest wavelengths. So like this is how the wavelengths are lined up. So from the neurological or the neural processing in the brain, The wavelength can influence whether we are more relaxed or we might be more agitated or excited. The other reasoning given is more like the nurturing or the cultural issue. Think about it. What do we associate the color blue with? When you think of blue, what do you think of? You think of the sky, the ocean, water. Again, things that are usually more relaxing, blue sky, blue water. When you think of red, what do you think of? Usually blood, stop, red stop sign. So again, these are not very relaxing things. It's more like be alert. So like red means stop, so something to be alert of. So again, that could be another factor. So again, there's an ongoing debate. But the finding is the outcomes are different. Reasoning, there have been two different schools of thought. Okay. Going along on the visual cue thing, another interesting aspect is how do we form perceptions of volume by looking at things. So let's say in an experiment where people are given these two glasses. So, and let's say, and actually in the experiment, the volume of the orange juice was exactly similar in the two glasses. And when people were asked, which one has more orange juice, what do you think they said? Which one would have more orange juice?
Tall.
Why? You're right, by the way, all of you, whoever said the tall one. Why?
Looks like more.
Looks like more, interesting, yeah. Looks like more.
We aren't good at converting the linear measure to a full three-dimensional volume, and that's difficult to do.
Interesting.
by sight.
No, interesting, yeah.
The tall one looks more full. It looks like 3/4 or more full. And the other one looks more like it's half full.
Oh, okay, that's my fault. I should have chosen a different set of pictures. But no, yeah, I can see your point, okay. Now, instead of making a judgment by looking at these, what if you had these two glasses and you were told they were totally full and you had your eyes blindfolded? Just from the touch, which one would have said was more? Would your answer be the same? Yeah, why? Why do you think? I saw 2 or 3 of you saying so. Bigger.
It takes up more space in your hand.
Okay, exactly.
Which one, the short one?
Right, okay. So that's because, actually that goes to the next thing. So basically when it's vision based, so when we form judgments from vision, as many of you said, from vision when we perceive volume, we look at the vertical, sort of vertical length or the vertical distance. So the taller one is in our brain, where as being more or bigger. Now when we are feeling something from the touch without being influenced by our sight, we actually feel the diameter, or in other words, the horizontal, sort of horizontal distance or horizontal length. So when it's the touching thing, the haptic-based evaluation, the smaller glass is perceived to be more because then it's the holding, as a couple of you pointed out. So this one is more than this one when you're holding it like that. So again, just to get started on the interactions between the different sensory cues. Okay. And along the same lines, so visual cues, we talked about how the volume perceptions might be different. The research in this area, it's also showing that even where you place the picture of your product on a package can influence your perceptions about product weight. And why should it matter? It can matter to some people if you correlate the lightness of a product with it being healthier or whatever. So interestingly, like when you have a picture like this versus this, where would you think people would perceive the product is weighing more? When it's at the bottom of a package, top of a package, left or right? What do you think? At the bottom? How about left or right? Which one is heavier? If it's left, right?
Probably heavier on the right.
Heavier on the right? Okay. Why?
I would think, from a visual weight standpoint, things that gravitate toward the bottom feel heavier.
That's fine.
The right, I'm assuming because people were more apt to be right-handed than left-handed, and use that as, so I don't know. It just feels like this would be heavier.
No, that's interesting. But remember, you're not actually feeling it. I can see where the right, left. You're actually seeing it. Which way do you see? Do you see from the right to left or left to right? Left to right. So that has implications. Okay. So first of all, the first point you answered correctly. So when the image of a product is placed at the bottom of the package, it's perceived to be heavier. Why? The gravitational issue, like heavier things, gravitate downwards. Now, how about left or right? So actually, when products are placed on the left side, they are perceived to be heavier. And sorry, once again. So when the product are placed in the top side and the left of the image, so that's when it's lighter. But when it's sort of heavier, it moves down. So there are two different things. You mentioned about the weighing thing. Their argument is more like you see from the left to right. So again, you're seeing this trend of the product moving away. So when it's actually at the bottom and on the right side, it's the heaviest. Top left side, it's lighter. So that's interesting. Although you gave the justification of it being caused from a different reason, that might be something to explore. Okay.
Excuse me, are
sure.
you referring to what's inside the thing like the SpaghettiOs versus the name of the product?
No, the product, the image of the product.
The thing, the actual thing that's inside.
Right. So like the chips, not the name. So these, or these, or these.
Because I was influenced by the size of the name.
Interesting.
As opposed to what was in it.
Yeah, I didn't focus on that on this slide, but that could be another interesting aspect. Like you're talking about the font or just the positioning, the size.
Yeah.
Yeah, font. Font size is bigger. I would think it's heavier, I think, conceptually. I would think. Again, I haven't seen research on that area. But I'm sure there must be some research which looked at the font size on the package. Yes, Bill.
In cultures that read from right to left, is that reversed?
Interesting. I would have talked about that towards the end. Like, again, these are from, let's say, the North American perspective. In many countries, like in the Middle East, they read from the right to the left. And all these studies that I'm talking about, whether it's conducted by me and my colleagues or someone else, have all been conducted mostly in North America, some in Europe. But who knows, if it was conducted in the Middle East, good question. It could have been well different. And that can actually be a good test for the theory, whether it's being driven by something else versus reading left to right. So yeah, we don't know about that. But culture plays a big role. So I won't be surprised if in some other culture they have a different take on these issues. Any other comments, questions? Along the same lines, visually, pictures that are simpler seem lighter to us than if it's a complex design. So anything that's more complex in terms of design, in our mind, we think it's heavier. So again, the visual, how visual perceptions influence our perception of things that are not supposed to be determined by vision. So just by looking at something, you're not supposed to guess its weight. But we do actually form perceptions based on other cues and other factors like gravity, complexity, and so on. Okay. Along the same lines, I'm sure all of you know whether you're right-handed or left-handed, right? All of you know that. I'm sure you do by now. Do you know whether you're right-eyed or left-eyed? How many of you know that? I need one or two, which is surprising. Usually, hardly anyone knows it. So this is a unique crowd. So at least 3 of you know that. Most of us don't know whether we are right-eyed. And yeah, I know. Usually people do that experiment. I've seen that whenever I talk about that. They close one eye versus left eye. No, I'm not talking about which one is strong, which one you are more dominated by. How come you know whether you're left-handed and right-handed, but you don't know whether you're right-eyed or left-eyed?
Because you use your hands individually and you use your eyes together.
Exactly. So this is more like a conscious sort of effort. Like you can control left, right. Visual movement, as I said earlier, it's not always sort of voluntarily sort of processing. So I see things sometimes even when I don't want to see it. But if I don't want to move my hand or touch it, I can actually control for that more easily. So most of the people in the world are right-eyed, actually. 2/3 of the people around the world. So why does it matter? Who cares? So if you're right-eyed versus left-eyed, your visual perceptions can be different from certain angles. For example, so this was an experiment done by a group of researchers in, again, neurological sciences. So they found that right-eyed people usually perceive an object to the right side of the frame to be larger and closer. Again, it's relatively. It's not like hugely different. So a right-eyed person would see this image slightly differently from a left-eyed person in terms of which side appears to be larger and closer. Again, it's marginally different. It's not like some of us are seeing one side really big, and the other group is seeing it totally differently, but it has implications. Okay, so having talked about vision, let's talk about some of those other sensory cues, and if time permits, we'll talk about the odor effects, and that's where I'm doing a lot of experiments. I have been doing for the last couple of years. Okay, so one key difference between the first sensory cue we talked about, the visual thing, versus the olfactory or the smell thing is, with the visual cues, we usually tend to attach labels. So we can attach labels if we want to. Like as I said, someone is wearing a black scarf, a green sweater, or like this is longer, this is thinner. So we can use labels, descriptive labels easily. With the odor, it usually becomes much more difficult in order to give labels. Most people are not able to give very descriptive or useful labels for different types of smells. However, we can distinguish between smells even without being able to give labels. So we can technically distinguish between more than 10,000 different kinds of smells. So our brain is sort of wired to do that. Excuse me. However, amongst all the sensory cues, the cue of smell is actually the least hardwired in the brain. Unlike some of these other sensory cues, and I'll talk about those later also, but just to get started, for the smell cue, it's actually developed over time. So for example, the taste cue, it's more hardwired. So if you give something really bitter to a baby, the baby would react negatively. Or if you give something really sweet to a baby, the baby would react in a positive way. So it's more hardwired. Smell is not so hardwired. So for example, most adults would find, let's say, the smell of human waste not very pleasant. But research has actually found that babies are indifferent to it. And in most cases, or in many cases, they actually like the smell of human waste. So they actually are not negatively affected by it. So the sense of smell is more sort of developed over time. It's acquired rather than being hardwired in the brain. As a result, the concept of smell is very, very subjective and varies across cultures. Just to give a very obvious example, like the smell of cheese, it's usually mostly desirable in most European and North American countries. But in most Asian countries, it's actually a very sort of negative connotation associated with the smell of cheese. So same thing with food. Like when I was a student at California, I had sort of roommates from different parts of the world, I mean, on and off. So some of my roommates, when they used to cook something which they thought were delicacies, I'm not making up this story. I mean, I couldn't stay in the apartment. I used to tell him, like, whenever you're cooking this, let me know, I'll just leave. So again, it's a smell thing. It was a really strong, pungent smell for me, but he found it as a delicacy. So again, the smell thing is highly subjective. Okay. Another interesting aspect is, and we don't realize it consciously, but research has shown that if you have a very pleasant experience, and if there is an ambient scent in the room that you associated with it, later in life, you would always have pleasant evaluations with that smell. So let me explain what it means. So let's say you are having a really good time, having fun, or having a pleasant experience, and there is some background smell that you're not aware of. And then later on, if you go to some other place or do something else in life, I mean, I'm sure there's memory inbuilt, but let's say a day later, if you're doing something else and you have the same smell in the background, you would try to be, or you will be subconsciously very happy or positive. And which is interesting. And in fact, one study that I believe a couple of psychology professors did, so they had, again, an experiment. So they had two groups. In one group, the people actually had an exam, like, which was very easy. So a test which was very easy. And they had this ambient room smell. And they recorded, again, physiological reactions, anxiety, and all so forth. And in another group, like, they were, the same ambient room smell was there, but they had a much more difficult task. Like, they had some really difficult puzzles, riddles to cross. So again, they were sort of, again, had a higher level of anxiety and so forth. A day later, again, he put these two groups of people in a different kind of task, the same task, again, the same room ambient smell. So the people the day before who had this ambient smell and had this light task, with the same ambient smell the next day, they were again more relaxed. But with this group, they had this association with the smell and, again, the anxiety. So the theory behind it, it could be more like an adaptive mechanism, like an evolutionary thing, like we might associate smell with our survival instincts. So if something negative happened with a certain kind of smell, we should, again, have our sort of guard up or react accordingly for the same kind of smell. So again, that can happen. And I already talked about this, the subjectivity of sense. Another interesting or unique aspect about the olfactory sense is that it's one of the slowest, actually, amongst all our senses. Just to give you things in perspective, it takes us, on average, 45 milliseconds to detect a visual object. It takes us almost 9-10 times that to detect odor. So it's a slower evaluation thing. So we are really slow in sort of detecting smell. And at the same time, odors are also the slowest to leave from perception. So it actually has a lingering effect. So it's more difficult or slower to acquire and slower to leave the system also. And why does it happen? There's a more ready-made physiological explanation for that. So basically the way the olfactory neurons travel to our brain, it's actually a slow process than we have with other cues like visual. And as a result, when you're trying to recall something about smell, it takes us almost twice as long. Okay. Scent also interestingly enhances memory capabilities. So if you if you're doing something and if you have a distinctive smell in the background, chances are you would remember that event more vividly. Again, we don't do it consciously, but that's what research has shown. So basically, when you have a consumption experience and a particular scent associated with it, you would remember it more concretely. As a result, not surprisingly, a lot of retailers are trying to have very distinctive store ambient scents. Victoria's Secret started that trend. Abercrombie & Fitch carries it to an extreme in terms of having really sort of a very distinctive smell. I don't like it personally, but I'm sure a lot of people do. I mean, they do good business. But usually you would associate memories with scents. Also, scents in many cases can evoke memories that are emotional in nature rather than some of these other visual cues. Okay. Couple of things, again, before I move to the other cues. Again, I'm keeping a sort of watch on the time. The acuity of smell, again, we don't realize it. It starts deteriorating pretty early, actually. We peak in terms of our sense capabilities when it comes to olfactory or smell in our 20s. After that, it's all downhill in terms of being able to distinguish smells. Again, we don't realize that subconsciously, but apparently it happens. And also, odor congruence plays a role. Like there should be a congruence between odor and the other factors. And I'll talk more about congruence in a few minutes. Okay, again, quickly, the third sensory cue, taste perception. What's unique about taste perception that we don't have with the others? Taste perception, in contrast to visual perception, you need strong proximality. Like you can only have the taste perception when an object is coming into direct contact with your tongue. So that's the only way you can have the taste perception. Another interesting feature about the taste perception is that most of our taste perceptions are actually formed before we put anything in our mouth. So when it comes to food, more than 80% of the taste perception of a food is formed before you even put it in your mouth. And I'll talk about studies where it actually highlighted that issue. And that's why many researchers went as far as to claim the tastiness of food has little to do with taste, actually, with the taste sense, but largely dependent on our other senses and even cognitive input. And I'll talk about some of those studies which mentions that. Okay. So first of all, what are the other factors that influence our taste perception? There are two other factors that influence our taste perception strongly. One is the visual aspects, the color or the visual cues. And the second one is the smell or the olfactory cue. So if you block someone's smelling capabilities, that person's ability to distinguish between food items deteriorates drastically. Like as a result, when you have a cold, you cannot always taste food properly because you cannot smell it. But I mean, logically, I mean, if it was based on taste perception, why should it matter if you have a cold? Because the air passageway is blocked. There have been several studies which highlighted this. A very interesting study not too long ago, about 5-6 years ago. Yeah, about 6, maybe 7, 2004 study, I believe. So these guys did a couple of really interesting studies. So all of you have had, I'm sure, let's say Coke, Pepsi, Sprite, right? So a Coke and a Sprite, like, do they taste the same? Most of us, would say they taste differently, right? And if you have a Coke versus a Sprite, you should be able to tell which one is what, right? Yeah, most of us should be able to do that. So these guys, they did an experiment where they basically blocked people's smelling capability through chemicals. So they were not able to smell the different beverages. And they were sort of had a blindfold kind of thing, and they couldn't see the color of the product. So these were basically, no, they didn't have the blindfold, but these were opaque cups, right? They couldn't see the color. So they could just sip it in an opaque straw. So they had Coke, Sprite, and so forth. More than 80% of the people could not distinguish which one was Coke and which one was Sprite when they could not see or smell it, just from the taste thing, which is pretty amazing. Like, you would think like these are very distinctively different tastes, but that was a really, interesting study, and they replicated it with different kinds of products. Like apart from beverages, I think they had some sort of sauces. Again, same pattern of results. When people could not see or smell it, they could not distinguish between standard sort of products that we otherwise can distinguish between. Another interesting study, even more recently, about 5-6 years ago, I think 2006 study. This was done by a couple of guys in the neurological sciences literature. It was very interesting. And I believe this was done in France with, at a school where there were students who were sort of becoming experts in wine tasting. So this was like a wine management school or wine tasting school kind of thing. So they had a group of people who were pretty much experts in when it comes to wine. So they had this white wine, and they poured in this odorless sort of color, the red color. Nothing else changed. The taste, the smell, nothing changed, but the color became sort of what a red wine would look like. And then people were allowed to sort of sample the wine, the red colored white wine. When people did that, almost half, I forgot the exact number, something between 50 and 55% of the participants described the taste of the wine as if they were having red wine. So even though it was white wine, they were sort of being influenced by the color. And again, these were not people like, the non-wine experts, like someone like me. So these were people who were into wines, knew what a wine taste was, should be like. But even when they had it, they used words to describe what a white wine should be. What a red wine should be. More recently, or around the same time actually, 2005, 2006, a couple of marketing guys actually did this study, where they had this cherry flavored drink that was actually having this orange color. And when people were asked what flavor this is, 40% identified it as orange. So again, it's the color and the smell that's influencing our taste, not actually what it tastes like. And also congruence plays a role when we are talking about the interaction between the senses. So when lemonade was colored as yellow versus red, people liked the yellow colored lemonade better. Again, the congruence thing. Okay. How do some of these other cues influence the taste perception? Sound. So again, studies have shown, like, let's say when you have potato chips, and if it has a louder sound, then it actually is perceived to be fresher and tastier. So again, the sound is used as a cue to influence our taste perception. But it's not only sensory cues that influence our taste perception. Sometimes it's cognitive inputs or informational inputs. So these have been studies that a lot of people have done. So, and they use different labels. So the same wine labeled from California versus from North Dakota, which one tasted more? Like, again, people thought the California one tasted better. Same thing someone did with Texas versus France, same results. Which is obvious, but if you think about it, if we form a taste perception, just from the taste, it should not matter. But we put in other inputs also. Excuse me. Same thing. Several marketing people have done this study. When people are given bottled water, they thought it tasted better, but it was actually tap water, same thing. This was an interesting study. Recently, they had this experiment where Coke drinkers, people were asked to have the different tastes of Coke versus Pepsi. Whether someone is a Coke lover and Pepsi hater, they could not distinguish between the taste of Coke and Pepsi. But interestingly, a Coke drunk from a properly labeled bottle tasted better than Pepsi. So if it's Coke drunk from an actual Coke can or bottle, it was somehow tasted better than one drunk from a Pepsi can or Pepsi bottle. Similarly, when someone, this is again an emerging field, people associate the taste and healthiness of a product in an inverse correlation basis. So anything that's perceived to be healthy, people perceive it to be of lower in taste. So again, an experiment was done where people were told the same food product was given to two different groups. In one group, they were told that this is a very healthy product. And in the other group, they were told it's not a very healthy product. And they were asked to evaluate the taste. So people who had the unhealthy label rated the product as tastier, rated the food as being tastier. So again, there's a negative correlation on that. Yeah.
The last line of that slide says taste perceptions are lower.
But perceive food to be healthy, yeah, healthy is lower, unhealthy is higher.
What do you mean by lower?
So if you...
They don't taste as good, or?
Right. So when something is perceived to be healthier, we think it doesn't taste that good. So as I said in the experiment, so there were two groups of people. So in one group, both groups got the same food item actually. This was, I believe it was a cookie. So both groups got the same cookie. In one group, the way the cookie was described, it was sort of perceived to be healthier. Like again, lower on calories and so forth, lower on cholesterol. In the other group, they were sort of given the impression it's high on calories, high on fat, high on cholesterol and so forth. And then these two groups were asked, like, how do you rate the taste of this cookie, of whatever food product it was? So the unhealthy group actually thought it tasted better. But again, it was the same thing, the same cookie. So again, we are influenced by other factors in terms of taste evaluations. And this is actually a big challenge in terms of if you're trying to make people eat healthy. Like somehow in our brain it's wired as if, and this might be more like a cultural thing, like throughout our lives we keep hearing this thing, like anything good in life are immoral, illegitimate, or unhealthy. So it's the same thing. So you keep thinking if it's sort of healthy, it cannot be tasty. So that might be the hard wiring in the brain. Okay. Let's talk about haptics, and then I'll go into the order effects that I'm trying to actually go through fast. Information seeking in terms of touch, it's again interesting. The touch is unique from all some of these other aspects is that it's very sequential in nature. Like I cannot touch more than a certain number of items at a time. Like I can maybe touch 3-4 items at a time. With visual cues, I can actually evaluate, hundreds of objects at the same time, as I said earlier. But with touch, I cannot do at more than 2 or 3 or 4 at a time. So it's very sort of limited in terms of getting information. And it's very sequential in nature, and as I said, there's limited scanning opportunity. You need proximal sense. And you cannot create the haptic experience or experience of touch in the absence of the physical product. So if you're selling something through a virtual media, like through a website, it's very difficult to create the concept of touch. You can create some of these other things, especially sound and sight, but the touch experience is difficult to create. Touch is complementary to vision, like our visual cues actually influence how we perceive something on touch. And we also have some stereotypical hand movements, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes in the context of the interactions. And this is maybe something that might be interesting for some companies where they are trying to develop technologies where you can have the haptic experience of touch. I was reading an article that there was this new startup company in Silicon Valley where they're trying to have this object like linked to a computing device where you can actually feel, let's say, the product features just from touching that object. But it's too early to be commercially launched, I'm told. Okay, so now let's get into the order effects that I wanted to talk about. So these are a series of experiments I've been doing for the last, I would say, 2-3 years at least, or more than that, 2007, 8. So yeah, three years now. So let's look at how the order in which you sample products or the order in which you're exposed to sensory cues, how does it influence your perceptions? Okay, so this is an experiment. This is actually a series of experiments that I have done. And I'm just reporting the results in the simplistic way, like the key effects. So let's say you are at Sam's Club or at Costco or BJ's. You've seen all the food samples that they hand out, right? So you can sample them. Or if you are at the mall, at the food court, you can get those free food samples at the food vendors. Does it matter the order in which you sample the food? Like, would you like, let's say the food are in independent evaluations, equally tasty. So would it matter, would you like the one that you had first or last? So would it matter? Ideally, from a rational point of view, it should not. Like, again, it should be the actual taste of the product, not the order. But in reality, the order matters actually. So the order in which you sample products influences your perception. And interestingly, the results are different for a product that's high on sensory aspects or that's experiential in nature versus something that's non-experiential in nature. So this is just one of the experiments. Let me run you through this experiment. So in one group in this experiment, people had non-sensory or non-experiential products like scissors. So they evaluated 2 scissors. Again, this is a simplistic experiment with 2 products, and it gets more complicated after that. So people were given 2 scissors, again, counterbalanced. Like again, some people saw, let's say, scissor A first and then B, someone saw B and A first. So people saw or evaluated 2 scissors for 25 seconds each. And in this other experimental group, people listened to 2 different musical pieces, again, 25 seconds length each. And these were foreign musical pieces, so there was no familiarity bias. And then they were asked, like, between these 2 products, which one did you like more? So in the scissors group, they were asked the same question. Between these 2 scissors, which one did you like more? For the music, they were told, which one did you like more? And we replicated this experiment with different products, beverages, cookies, and so forth. Interestingly, the results are completely different, or completely opposite, I should say. So the red line represents, or the red bar, I should say, represents the proportion of participants who prefer the first product in the sequence, scissor 1 versus scissor 2. And the red column sort of denotes the percentage of participants who preferred the second product. So when it comes to informational products that people evaluate in a sequence, the overwhelming majority of people, most people like the one they sampled first. But when we move to something high on sensory or experiential aspects, the results pretty much almost reverses. So most people liked the second one more actually. Whether it's a beverage, cookie, music, yes?
I'm just wondering how you control for the ordering effect. Like, how do you know that there wasn't something else?
Absolutely. Everything was counterbalanced. So let's say the 2 scissors, like they were randomly given. So let's say one is red and one is blue. So say Bill would get the red one first and the blue one first. Russ would get the blue one first, red one first. So again, this was randomly counterbalanced. So there was no order effects per se. Same thing with the music. So it was on a computer, so it was counterbalanced. So half the people saw, let's call it music X first and Y second. The other half saw Y and X. Right. Otherwise, there could be a bias due to something being really better. We try to control that through pre-tests and all, but still in the main experiments, we counterbalanced it. So why do you think it happens? Like, why for the informational products or non-sensory products, we like the first one, and for sensory products like music, video clips, I've done it with music, video clips, beverages, chocolates, cookies, again, different settings, and I'll talk about some of those. It's a standard pattern. People usually prefer the second one. Any guesses why this might happen? Anything different when we evaluate something like, let's say, desks? So when we are buying desks or chairs versus music, beverages and all.
More senses are involved.
Right, and?
You forget music more quickly.
Okay, yeah, so if we actually relate what both of you said, yeah, we are getting towards the answer. Yes?
I would think that there'd be an orientation possibly towards satisfy signals, the experiential, with the non-experiential products, the scissors. Is it good enough? Oh, the first one's good enough. Well, I'm not really paying much attention to the second one. Whereas with the Experiential product is, do I really, really like it? Which one is actually best? In which case, you go in thinking, first of all, well, I can do better than this.
Right. So if we actually combine the what three of you said, we actually have the answer. So right. So basically, when we are evaluating a non-experiential product, we are evaluating non-sensory cues or informational cues, like the color, the shape, and so forth. So these are information that are coded in our memory, or what we call short-term working memory. So when we evaluate products in a sequence, look at it, think about it logically. So we are putting information in our memory. So the first piece of information is getting into our memory when it's less crowded. So when we are getting into the second piece of information, we are not actually evaluating, as you said, mainly because our memory is more crowded now. And I've actually done some of these experiments on myself using different scenarios. Try it out at home. Look at 3-4 different phone numbers. Like just look at them and then try to recall. Chances are, if you're looking at 2 or 3, you will remember the first one most vividly. And if you have 7 or 8, then you remember the first and the last one most vividly. So try it out. I mean, it should work for most of you. Because again, when you are doing the first piece of information, the concept is what is called information rehearsal. So we rehearse that information in our mind, not always consciously, but subconsciously. So when we are coming to the second or the third one, our memory doesn't have capabilities anymore to sort of do the rehearsal. So it's basically not even processing it. When it comes to sensory cues, there is no scope for rehearsing. Like how do you rehearse like the taste? Like it's more abstract for lack of a better word. So it's more like a memory trace. So what happens when you have a trace and you put in an additional sensory stimulation? So that erases the earlier trace in memory. So the later ones are more vivid in your mind when you're recalling. So it again erases your memory. So again, try it out with different products. I actually use different products. I almost always do these experiments on myself before I try it out. And it actually works. So with beverages, it can be actually, it should work. Okay. And this is basically what we talked about. I gave you the theoretical explanation. And then in the next set of studies, so my co-authors and I, we tried to look at what about if we extend this phenomenon to sensory cues rather than products. So would it matter if we saw something first versus if you smelled something first? So how do the sensory cues interact? Okay, so as you remember, we talked about these 5 sensory cues. Now, you cannot have sequential order effects for all the sensory cues. So for example, it's impossible to taste something and then see it in the real world. Like, I mean, it's very unlikely you'll put something without even looking at it. So you can actually smell something before seeing it. For example, in fact, I have these scenarios. Like, let's say if you're at a chocolate shop, from a distance, you can sometimes see the chocolates before you actually smell and enter the store. Or you might be passing at the mall, I mean, next to a restaurant or a chocolate store, you might smell things without having seen that product. So you can have the sequential order effects. Okay, so the question is, would your evaluation of the chocolate be different if you saw it first versus if you smelled it first? What do you think? You guys have been really good at speculating or guessing the answers, so we'll see. Let's see how it plays out.
Yes, that smelling it first would create more favorable impressions.
Or seeing first, okay. Why?
Smelling has more direct connection to emotional memory.
Oh, okay. Okay. Any other takes on it, Chris?
Thinking of something like a chocolate shop, if you're walking by on the outside, you're going to be immediately interested in it, but unable to smell the chocolate. And so by the time you get to smell it, your interest is greatly heightened.
Okay, so you're saying your evaluation would be higher if you see it first and...
In those things with which you have a positive association.
Bill, I'll come to you in a moment. I think you had your hand up earlier.
I'm thinking of bakeries.
Oh, good.
Bakeries and grocery stores, right?
Absolutely.
I think they probably sell more bakery when they're actively baking.
Mm.
And the smell is brought to the store. So I think smell is a much
powerful.
I was going to say something similar. That I know of bakeries and cookie shops that actually pipe the smell of baking cookies out onto the sidewalk. Now, I don't know if that makes it more likely once you taste it to like it, but it certainly is more likely to bring you into the store to buy it.
Okay, attraction, right. So basically the answer depends. In some cases it would work, and actually it makes good business sense, like at a restaurant or bakery. Why? We'll see that in a minute. But actually, under normal circumstances, you would actually have a higher or more favorable evaluation of a product if you actually get to see it first and then smell it. Why? I mean, I'll explain that. But not always, not always. I mean, you guys were also right. I'll come to that in a minute. So in general, like you would have a more favorable evaluation of, let's say, a food product if you see it first and then smell it. However, if you have this heightened sense of arousal, let's say if you're highly hungry, if you're very hungry, the effects actually reverse. Then actually the smell thing would work better, which makes sense at the bakery or let's say at restaurants. Chances are you are hungrier when you're at the bakery or at the restaurant. That's why, as you said, like they send out the smell thing. Yeah.
So I wonder if part of it is, since smell and taste are related, if you smell it first and then taste it, you may be disappointed because it's not quite as good as you were hoping. But if you see it first, you have a lower expectation that the smell and the taste together, you're getting the joy of the smell and you're evaluating that as part of the product. Whereas in the other one, you have already accepted that and you're evaluating what you get on top of that.
No, that's a very interesting take. I mean, we didn't think along those lines. We were looking more at the interaction. Basically, studies have shown like the visual cues tend to dominate our other cues. So our visual cues shape our other cues. So that means if you already have a positive evaluation through the visual cue, the smell would be even better, like if you have it later on. Versus when you have the smell earlier, it would not necessarily influence your visual sort of perception. So that's the theory. But what you said makes sense actually. So I should look at the data. Maybe there's something there. So actually these are the results. So this is, as I said, so when people looked at the color, so in this experiment was, I mean, again, I did it with multiple products, so with beverages. So this is how I did the experiment. So in one group, they got the beverages in transparent cups, so they could see it from a distance before they actually could smell it. And in the other group, they had this opaque sort of cups, but the smell was sort of put in through a porous container, like they could smell it before they could open the lid and see the color. So when they saw the color first, and then the scent, the evaluation was higher on a 1 through 7 scale than the other way around when they actually had the scent. But the effects reversed when people were highly hungry. So this experiment, this particular one, we actually did at a restaurant in Beverly. So one of my co-authors, she was at UMass Amherst, and her family has a chain of restaurants in that area, North Shore area. So we actually went to the restaurant, and what we did was we set up shop, and it was a dad's restaurant, so we could do anything we wanted. And we gave people free sort of chocolate samples. And how do we manipulate hunger? So half the people had the chocolates before they had the main meal. The other one had it afterwards. And we sort of controlled for whether they could see it first and again versus smell it first, again, which was easy to do, opaque versus transparent containers. So the results replicated under low hunger levels. So people had more favorable evaluation when they saw the color first than when they had the scent thing first. But the results drastically reversed when they were highly hungry. So again, that makes sense in the bakery thing. So chances are if you're really hungry at the bakery, the smell thing again arouses your hunger even more, and then you like the thing even more. So the scent thing works better over here. Okay. Any questions so far? Then we tried to extend this finding in the context of visual versus auditory or sound cues. So then we had a series of commercials where people could actually, and this was a vacation video kind of commercial. So this was a view of an ocean resort and then the soothing sound of the ocean. So in one group, they actually saw the visual thing first, the ocean, the resort, and then they could listen to the wave, the sound of the ocean. And in the other group, it was the other way around. They first heard about the ocean sort of sound, And then they saw the visual image of the resort. And again, the visual cues dominated. This is actually a very dynamic or consistent finding. Visual cues tend to dominate our other cues. So, and extending that research, we are claiming that when we are exposed to sensory cues in a sequence, if the visual cue is earlier in the sequence, our overall perceptions are higher. So our liking of the product, taste perception, it's much higher over here. The visual cue, again, when it's earlier. Yeah, go ahead.
Have you tried these experiments with noxious or unpleasant things that people would want to avoid?
Right, so that goes in a different direction, so I don't have the slides. But this experiment, the one with the scissors and experiential like music, so we actually in this paper had one experiment where and there were no non-experiential products in that experiment. It was only experiential products, whether they are desirable versus non-desirable, and that's a very, very good question. So the effects actually reversed when it's non-desirable. And that's consistent with the theory. So if your subsequent sensory cues erase the earlier ones, so if it's highly undesirable, so we had actually beverages. So I actually got the name of this store in Connecticut. I forgot the name, but you can order actually really obnoxious, beverages. I don't know, maybe some people buy it. These are very strong, pungent tasting beverages. And it's perfectly hygienic and safe, but it's highly concentrated, tastes really bad. So when we had those really bad beverages, people had relative preference for the earlier one. Because again, the later one erased the bad memories of the earlier one. The last one was really negative, bad experience. The previous one wasn't so bad. And actually, if you extend some of these findings to recalling things from the past, it's the same thing. Like things are always much better in the past, like the good old days and all, because the subsequent memories erase any negative aspects associated with the earlier experiences. So the later one is more vivid or distinguished in terms of the negative aspects. So I did do that with the negative thing in this context, absolutely. Any other questions, comments? Okay, so the last couple of things I'll talk about is just some of these emerging trends. So this is one of the last few slides. So extending some of the present research findings and what's going on. Like, as I said earlier, when you go to a store, you are exposed to different kinds of sensory stimulations, like whether it's the sound, like music, background music, ambient smell, like the visual displays, like visual appeal. Interestingly, research has shown, again, this is fairly recent, 6-year-old research. This was by a couple of marketing professors. So they found that when you have ambient music in a store, people tend to spend more. Or if you have ambient smell in a store, people tend to spend more. Again, this is easy to do in an experiment. Like in fact, we are planning to do something similar at a store in Boston. Like on one day have the music, the other day don't have the music, and you can control for those. But the more interesting finding is when the store had both music and the ambient scent, people were actually spending less. So let's actually go through this step by step. So what is the reason? Why do people spend more when there is background music only or just ambient scent? So these researchers, they proposed it's like basically arousing our senses. So when you have the music thing on, like our senses are aroused, so you are basically more in the spending mode, like you are in an aroused state, so you want to spend. Now, when they are present individually, you are aroused enough to sort of have the push or the momentum to spend. So you're spending more time sort of spending money. But when you have a combination of two, you are over-aroused. So your need for arousal, for lack of a better word, is sort of satisfied. So you don't need to spend to sort of, feel even more aroused or feel better. So people were actually spending less. That's, again, a theory. So they didn't exactly test it out. There could be alternative explanations. But this is an interesting thing. And if you go to stores, most stores actually have both, especially stores like Abercrombie & Fitch and like, they have this really loud music, ambient scent. So maybe, I don't know if they're overdoing it. But Abercrombie & Fitch's target market is different than like people like you and me or most of these study participants. So maybe, and as I said earlier, sensory cues are highly subjective. So for certain age groups, maybe what might be an optimal level of arousal, sensory arousal, might be an overkill for some of us. Yes?
One question I had was the type of music. So if you play classical music versus hard rock,
Good question.
are you aware of any studies?
Not.
Was it classical background?
This was more like popular music, like pop, or like, again, not something, not hard, metallic, like not too loud, but it wasn't classical, not Beethoven style. So this was, I forgot the exact simulation they used, but it would be like more popular music, like pop music.
Use that?
Sorry?
Use that.
What's that?
Like elevator music.
Oh, elevator music? No, I don't.
Muzak.
Okay.
They kind of denigrate it. They call it Muzak.
Oh, okay, okay. No, but this wasn't anything extreme, but the point that you mentioned could be valid. Like the type of music can actually have effects on our sensory arousal. And again, it could be age group versus different cultures. For example, and studies have shown that hip hop is very popular with younger people, like especially teenagers, but strongly disliked by older adults. So again, there's a strong distinctive groups for that. And again, it's a subjective nature of sensory cues. So again, the recommendation is not to overstimulate customers, but then you need to know who the customer is. So, and what is overstimulation for one group might be optimal stimulation for another group. Okay. And again, we are just starting to see the interaction between the sensory cues, like the papers that I talked about, the studies. These are actually among the first papers on interaction between sensory cues, which is surprising. Like, I got a bunch of awards for that kind of research, which we would otherwise think is obvious. Like, how come no one examined the sequential order effects of sensory cues? But apparently no one did, which is good for us. But we are basically starting off on that. But there's a rich scope for doing research, finding out the order effects between sensory cues. Interestingly, there has been very little research on the effects of haptics or touch. We do not know much about how touch sort of interacts with our other sensory cues. I've seen a few papers, but there is hardly any research on how touch influences our other sensory cues. Okay, so that's pretty much what I wanted to talk about. So any comments, questions you might have. So it's open discussion on any topic you might have.
And let's use the
Russ.
microphone here.
But I can hear you clearly better maybe from this side, or is it for the recording?
Recording.
Okay.
Okay, my question is, I think is related. Why is it that in geographic areas that are very hot, that food tends to be hot as well?
Interesting.
I have always wondered that, and I've never been able to find anyone who could answer that.
Yeah, I don't think, I mean, you'll be satisfied today. You won't get an answer today, but I can speculate. If we are looking at, again, the sensory arousal thing, maybe in warmer climates, their level of arousal is already heightened in terms of like sort of sweating more, having a warmer, more humid, hotter climate. So maybe they need something higher to get that sensory arousal, let's say from food, like spicy food. So not surprisingly, now that you mention it, people in more subtropical areas eat spicier food, like whether it's Mexico, South Asia, or even within the United States. I was in California for a while, so people in the Southwest have a lot spicier food than what people have in the Northeast. So again, could be the sensory sort of arousal thing. It could also be, I'm thinking like if it's a survival technique, a sort of adaptive evolutionary mechanism. I'm trying to sort of think out loud. So maybe over time, like I don't know if spicier food acts as an immune system against germs, because in warmer places you would have different kinds of diseases. So I don't know, I'm just guessing. I'll come back to you. I think you had your hand up earlier. Yeah.
I think it's a more prosaic concept. In warmer climates, the meat would spoil sooner, and they would use higher spices to cover the taste of the bad meat.
Right, as I said, could be the evolutionary thing also, like again, adapting against any sort of germs, so whether it's food being spoiled or other kinds of germs.
Could be where the hot chilies are grown. Exactly.
Could be. That's a very valid point, right? So that again is the cultural thing, like you eat what is available. So people in Japan eat more fish, maybe because it's an island, so they have more fish. So again, it could be a factor of geography, absolutely, yes. I'll come back to you in a minute. I promise George will finish.
I was going to comment along the same lines. In the Middle Ages, people put a lot more spice in food in Western Europe than we do now. And of course, they had no refrigeration.
Exactly. So it acted as a preservative, actually, like when people used to be on ships for 6 months without refrigeration.
But they also had a completely different theory about what constitutes healthy food.
True.
And they did use hot spices as an effort to balance out the 4 elements of the food.
Yes.
Well, I had read somewhere, and I don't know really if it's true, but that in very hot climates, people can lose their appetite when they get to eat, so the spicy food is just stirred
Interesting.
up.
Yeah, you're less hungry when it's really hot. Like, I mean, if you're in, let's say, Arizona, I mean, during August, you would lose your appetite. Like, yeah, that's true. I mean, I was in Singapore, even in February, and it's on the equator, it's really hot, and you don't feel like eating anything. Yeah, that's a good point. Yes, I'll come to you.
What do you see as some applications of your research into the digital environment where we won't have access to smell, something touch, and other senses?
Absolutely. Right. As I briefly touched upon earlier, even in the digital media, you still have access to some of these other sensory cues like visual, auditory. And as I said, we are doing some research right now where we found interesting results. Just the color of the web page influences our perceptions of fear, risk perception, and so forth. That's one aspect. And then again, I read an article recently where there are these companies which are trying to come up with products that can appeal to our other sensory cues, even in a digital media. Like, again, I'm going blank on the name of that company offhand, but I'm sure you can Google it up easily, where you can attach a device to your computer, and let's say you want to smell something, it would emit that equivalent odor. So I don't know if it's commercially available, but it's definitely developed. And there's actually more than one company. Again, I'm going blank on the names, but it's very easy to find out. There are 2 or 3 companies that I read about, mostly US-based, Silicon Valley, where it's like a peripheral which you can attach and it can appeal to your other senses. And that would influence your perception of the product when you're shopping. So it's not only the color, but also the smell. The haptic thing, I know there are some companies doing research on that, but as far as I know, it's too early to have any commercial viability. Yes?
Yeah, I wanted to touch on the topic about sensory overload. There's been books written on emotional branding.
Ooh.
So do companies literally look at sort of the negative aspects of this? Say fast food, like Denny's is always cold and bright orange and we want to get in and out of there. Do they leverage this kind of stuff with sense and smell, like to sort of manipulate the audience? I mean, is that why this research is being done for positive, but also leveraging the negative effect to get more product pushed through a company or something?
Right. So basically, there are 2 aspects there. One, as you mentioned, the Denny's example. For some companies, there is no, that's okay. There is an association, Wendy's or any company. Basically, the brand names are usually associated with some colors. So that goes beyond the sensory appeal per se. It's like you would associate McDonald's with the yellow, red thing, Pepsi with Pepsi with blue, Coke with red. So again, that's a different connotation. Like they want to have this image in your mind where if you see a color, you would link it with a brand. So that's one aspect. The other aspect, like manipulating those to appeal to your senses, yeah, companies do it all the time. Like, if they want you to act in a certain way, they can do these, as I said. Like, and again, I have way more research that I can show in 1 hour, but the pattern is the same. Like, the sensory aspects can influence your behaviors in other ways. Like one experiment it showed, if you have music in the store, people not only spend more, they spend more in terms of money, but they also spend more in terms of time. People usually stay in a store longer, or they would eat for a longer duration if there is background music in a restaurant. So chances are, if you're in a store for a longer period of time, you would spend more. Again, they are correlated. And companies do manipulate on that. And if they want you to get out of there fast, talking about music, right, there was one study which showed that louder music usually makes people sort of, move through things faster. Because we are sort of aroused by the music. So softer, slower music tends to make people slower in terms of what they're doing. And louder, faster music tends to make people move faster. Again, it's subconscious and it's all at the second level or millisecond level differences in an experiment. But there are significant effects.
So do you see companies I don't really know how to ask this question, but for example, I guess my experience is if you go into Borders or Barnes & Noble, you go in there with like a couple of books in mind, you get in there and the music is so loud that you can't remember something. It's like, it's almost becoming, it's a distraction. I mean, do people ever, do these companies go, we need to look into this issue? Are they getting, like, how does this happen? Do people go to the website and write in the feedback? Like, how are they enlightened that this is an issue?
Oh, they can easily find that out. Like, I don't know about Borders, but there are some supermarket stores. Absolutely.
We've all done that. We've gone
Exactly. I agree.
What I came in here for because it's got some thing going on.
Right. I mean, I know of some supermarkets who do that. Again, I cannot reveal names, but at Bentley we have this sort of lab where companies actually do focus group sort of scenarios, and they do experiments also. So we were involved actually with a company recently where they wanted to see some of these things. So they stimulated a store environment, and they had these different kinds of music. They didn't use ambient sound in that experiment. The music thing, loud, soft, faster, slower. And they were trying to see people's reactions. And we did that at actually Bentley, the lab. And the results we actually coded and we gave to that company. And I'm sure they're using it in terms of implementing it. So companies do it all the time. Like, they do it in-house and they also do it in collaboration with universities. And in fact, Rachel mentioned about the Nokia. So when I got this invitation to go to do this series of talks at Nokia and some other schools, what I found out was in Europe, they have this really strong collaboration between university and industry. So where the universities do a lot of these experiments that these companies can use. So for Nokia, a lot of their research is actually done at a place in Tampere actually, that's how they pronounce it. Tampere University of Technology. They have actually an in-house, on-campus Nokia building where they do all these kinds of experiments. And I'm right now involved with some of those experiments. It's more user experience related, not the ambient thing. But it's like how the color or the touch of a device can influence your perception. So companies, I mean, spend a lot of money doing this. Literally billions, as I said earlier. Even on product samples, they spend over $1 billion annually in the US. Anything else? Yes.
Just the last couple of weeks, we've been conducting some research. We're starting to sell product clothing. What's tough about selling clothing on an e-commerce site is that people can't touch it, right? So you have some challenges with that. So we did an early study where we sent our target audience some samples of our product. It was a polo shirt. We're starting to do embroidery. And we asked them about how important was quality to them and what about the product was important, like the thickness, the touch, you know, if it shrunk or not. We got different feedback of what they thought was a quality product. Now we're starting to sell that, and we did a usability study last couple weeks, and so we noticed on our site we have a large preview of that product, and they're able to zoom in really close, and also when they create their embroidery, there's a real-time update, and you get to see the details of the thread. And then when we asked them after the study, did that give them an impression of good quality? We heard that it did, because they're able to visually see it. Because how do we substitute them, not sending them a sample ahead of time, and them feeling comfortable enough to trust the site that they're going to get a product that they're going to be happy with? So this sort of makes sense with what you were saying today, that this visually they can just see it. Now we also learned that a good description is really important to them as well. So we also have a good description, and a site that does a really great job of that is like LL Bean. I don't know if you've ever gotten to LL Bean. They do a great job of you're able to see products, you're able to zoom in. They have this thing called the quick view now. You can really blow it up and you can move it around. And they also have really good product descriptions, very detailed. They even have a quick short description, and then if they want even more detail. So these are ways, I think, to sort of substitute, you know, the experience that people usually get when they go to a store. I don't know if you have any comments about that.
No, absolutely, yeah. So basically, with clothing products, a big challenge with existing technology is you cannot actually appeal to many of the sensory aspects. And more importantly, like clothing items, people prefer to touch and feel and try out before buying. So companies are trying these different methods, as you said. In fact, Banana Republic, they have this really nice website where you can do similar things, as you said, regarding LLB. Another thing they're trying is they're trying to supplement the sensory cues with the informational cues. So I remember with the Banana Republic website, even Armani Exchange, if you go there, they would 40S, I mean, it's not standard, although it should be the standard, or let's say pant size men's 34, 32, it varies across stores. I'm sure all of you know this, different brands have different things. So many of these websites have detailed information regarding actual measures. So that's one way to do it. One company, and I believe it's Banana Republic, but I could be wrong. It could be also one of these other brands like Armani Exchange. So they actually have a really nice forum where people can ask questions, and there are others who would respond to that. For example, if there's a particular Banana Republic style or size, people can ask what are does it run too tight? Is it loose? And I've seen responses like, oh, Banana Republic is more like European light, so their sort of 40 would be, let's say, 38 at some other store or whatever. So again, there are ways where you can supplement the sensory thing with non-sensory information cues.
And actually, we did a follow-up study, so we actually had them purchase the product, and then now we're calling them to ask them what they actually think of the product. So we do have a chart, a size chart for ladies and men, so that gave them some information. But we're finding that we're talking to, we've only started calling a few people because they're just starting with our product, that some of the women think that the sizing is not true to fit and that it's a little bit longer. So it's interesting.
Right.
How do you, explain something?
That's why the forums come into play. When you have that experience, if you mention that, the next buyer is a more satisfied buyer because he or she would buy accordingly. So that's why a lot of these companies are going for this forum or question answer sort of website kind of thing. So yeah, that's one way to do it. Any other questions? Talking about sensory reaction, this is again something interesting I read. Usually when we say any questions, we wait for how long? Maybe 2-3 seconds, and then we just move on. A lot of people might have questions and they don't say it because apparently on average, it's not an experiment I did. I just read it somewhere, an article. It takes about 8 seconds, 7 or 8 seconds for someone to actually realize they have a question and then raise their hand. But most of us might actually move on in 4 seconds, so just to let you know. So any questions?
Give us 8 seconds.
Yeah, I usually wait 7 seconds. Yeah, seems like we're done. We're done. Thank you. Thank you.